Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Dr. Karen and this is Karen's Colours. This week we're going to be looking at how colours interact with numerology, with astrology, and also with, of course, chakras. There are differences and there are similarities, and we'll guide ourselves through this. And just as a special treat at the end, I'll start doing colour analysis the way I do it, just to give you a taste. So this is part 2 of introducing colour analysis, and this time we're going to be talking about the tarot, chakra, numerology, and how they all interact in colour readings. Let's begin with colours and numbers. There are 2 primary viewpoints, those of numerology and another little-known area called synesthesia. Numerology is dependent upon Eastern mythology and also Western methodologies. Taking Eastern mythology firstly, this links numbers, colours, and the 5 elements, that is, the 5 elements within the Eastern mythology: wood, fire, water, air, and metal. It uses the numbers 1 to 9, which are linked to specific colour palettes. And of those colour palettes, there are certain colours that are indicative of those 9 numbers. And each one of them there, you can see, is listed as belonging to an element, a number, a season, and then a specific little palette of colours. They're associated with what is known as the low shoe grid, which determines personality types from the birth dates that people have. And if you want to know a little bit more about this, I suggest that you look up low shoe, Google it, and see what it has to say about you. The colour links that come out of the low shoe grid determinations are considered to be lucky. Western methodologies are a little different. They have some similarities, but they also look at things from a different perspective altogether. They also use the numbers 1 to 9, and those numbers are linked to letters of the alphabet, so that each letter of the alphabet has a specific number and it also has a specific colour. And those colours are the same for the chakras from 1 through to 7, but after that, magenta and gold are 2 colours that become 8 and 9 for numerology, but are not necessarily the same for all chakras, as we learned earlier on. I'll put a link to that in the description. All numbers are reduced to the numbers 1 to 9 to allocate a name's power. So when you are calculating your name, if it comes out to say 26, as does Karen, then we add the 2 and the 6 together, which gives us the magic power number of 8. So that's something else you might like to try. The colours are very specific to the numbers and they are linked to the chakras. Now let's look at synesthesia. It's a mixing up of sensations where people see words as colours or see numbers as colours, or they can taste music. And those sensations allow them to have an entirely different experience of reality. There are no limits to the numbers that can be seen by a synesthete. And here we have the numbers 1 to 15 and the associated colours that come from a scientific review of a number of different people with synesthesia who have indicated what colours they associate with specific numbers. Now, there is no real uniformity of colour sensation. It appears to be something that is quite unique to each individual. However, there are some similarities. 0 and 1 are predominantly black or white, as is the number 10, but all the other numbers have red, blue, green, and yellow as predominant colours for those numbers. As the numbers get higher, there are fewer numbers that can be classified as having specific colour preferences. But certainly from 1 to 10, you can see there are quite a number of people who will use the same or see the same colours when they are thinking about specific numbers. There are additional uses of colours and numbers as well that we have in our Western society. One of them is branding. Now, the interesting thing here with branding is that they use a 12 colour analysis, but they add cyan and delete white. Color astrology is another area that where colors and numbers are aligned. Aries is the first of the zodiac creatures, and so it has a number of colors that we often associate with the number 1, and so all the way through to Pisces. Each of those color palettes for those zodiac signs also have a power color. That is, one of the colors of the palettes of each palette is designated as being the most powerful color for that particular sign, and so therefore has abilities that other colors for that sign do not have. Interestingly, there are also zodiac avoidance colors, colors that each of the various star signs should avoid attracting into their lives. And we can also color code the year. And here, instead of 1 being associated with red, as it does with everywhere else, it's actually associated with red violet. And 12, December, the last month of the year, is associated with the color red. So each of these methods use or rely upon an example of the color wheel, but each of them uses it slightly differently, although, as I said, there are similarities. So what then are the colors of the chakras? Well, we already introduced these in a previous video, and I have the link in the description. But chakra colors are important for spiritual balance, and each color enhances a psycho-emotional physical state. That is, it has a psychological component, an emotional component, and it also has a physical component. The imbalances can be seen in an aura through what is known as Kirlian photography. And here are a series of images that indicate the various auras of a number of different people. If there are imbalances in those auras, then those are treated by application of the unbalanced colors. And that can be through food, clothing, or adding it into an environment, or it can be used through practices such as color breathing and meditation. There is a link with these colors to the tarot, of course. Auralite and Aurosoma, which I've already mentioned before, and the link is in the description, are the 2 most commonly known that link colors and tarot and numerology. They use 12 colors in dual form, so that they're in pairs, and they have an upper and lower color positions. They present their colors in these lovely little bottles that absolutely glow under light. They are beautiful to look at, but you can see quite distinctly that there is an upper color and a lower color. These colors simulate the mind spirit versus the body and action. And the internal drives versus external responses can also be examined using choices made by these colors. And past learning versus current activities is another area that can be examined in using choices of these color bottles. What are the interpretations that adhere to these chakras? Well, as we already know, they focus on spiritual energies. So red is associated with passion and energy, orange with creativity and sociability, yellow with learning and experience, green with values and freedom, blue with communication and understanding, indigo with safety and silence. Violet is for change and adaptability, magenta, work and practicality, pink is associated with love and acceptance, turquoise with cooperation and intuition, gold with wisdom and prosperity, and white or clear is associated with curiosity and transcendence. Looking at the aura light colors, I did not do an Aurosoma course, but I'm more familiar with these. You can see the 78 colors that are, or color combinations that are associated with the tarot. This top row represents the major arcana. Then we have wands, cups, swords, and pentacles. And you can see here there is quite a variety of color words or language that can be used to give descriptions to how people feel and what's going on in their lives as they choose those combinations. There are dark and light versions of some colors, so that we find here the first two combinations in the auralite system and the last combination in the auralite system have dark versions of colors, and there are numerous light versions of colors specifically between the swords. There are additional non-tarot combinations that exist in the auralite system. There is one combination that appears prior to the first of the major arcana cards, and another that exists at the end after the world, which was green and pink. How do we do an analysis using these colors? Well, it depends on the questions that are asked. And you can ask questions in singly or in groups, and each of those will require a different type of choice. They are all linked to unconscious knowledge. So the idea is that you know in an unconscious way the answers to the questions, even though logically choosing a color combination makes no real sense. One combination questions, in other words, choosing just one pair of colors, will focus on what is going on in your present. And you can ask questions like, how do you feel now? Or what's your biggest struggle now? If you choose two combination questions, then those are usually focused on comparisons. Left hand versus the right hand will give you an idea of the public self versus the private self. Or you could do something like ask the person to describe your mother and your father. And those two combinations will give you a fair amount of information about how that person feels and how they remember or experienced their parenting. If you have three combination questions, then these are often focused on choices. And those choices are, what do you want? What is hindering those choices? And how do you intend to achieve them? Four combination questions are the ones used most often with the auralite analysis. And these are what is considered to be a full reading. It examines the past, the present, and the future of the querent. And the past has both positive and negative influences. So therefore you need four combinations. The links between the colors of the first and last duo combination are important because they create a cycle of life experiences. And sometimes, of course, you won't get a color link between the first and last choice. So therefore you can choose up to 12 duo combinations. Now, I do it slightly differently because I found that the color duos that were used for the chakras didn't give me enough words for the analyses that I was doing among the clients I was seeing at the time. And here is an example of the range that I put together. Now, the first thing I did was eliminate all the light and dark versions. I kept the colors simple. I also then broadened it to include every single duo combination. So instead of 78 or 80 combinations, I now had 144 to work with. I also inserted some additional colors. I started with black because I felt that black needed to balance out white, and cyan and lime were added because those colors seemed to be important to the clients that I was seeing at the time. At one stage, I had an issue of too many colors. When you consider that I was working at one time with over 300 color combinations, that is an enormous number of glass bottles to be carrying around, and was also a very cumbersome way of setting up color readings. And then I discovered basic color terms, and that overthrew everything, because from then on, I wasn't working with chakra colors. I was working with the colors that actually link to the sorts of social concepts that we have within our cultures. So what are the alternatives that we can have in duo presentations? Because I didn't want to carry those glass bottles around with me anymore, I developed some color charts, and I did those either as paintings or printed versions, and I also did them as embroideries. Embroideries turned out to be rather popular because people would focus on the images far more carefully than they did on the paintings or printing. I also made color cards. Now, color cards gave me an advantage in that I could now reduce the number of combinations I needed to provide, because I didn't need to provide both for example, red over yellow and then yellow over red. They could all appear on the same card. There was a problem, however, in that it could only be used for shorter analyses, that is questions 1 to 3, rather than the full analysis, because there was no chance to link a reversal of the color combinations from one card to another. But there are other alternatives for presenting those duo combinations, and I'm working on some of them now, and when I get them done, I shall certainly show them to you. This is my color chart, the color chart that I use for an analysis these days. And you can see that there is a color on the outside of each of those images, and that it represents what's going on in the real world, and the color that is on the inside is what is going on in the internal world. So I'm pretty sure that by now you might like to see an example of how I do a color analysis. So let's get into it. Take an example, shall we? If you were asked a simple question, describe your father and your mother. If you were a very primitive person, that is, you didn't have many color words, then you might use white or black. These two colors give us all the information that we need to encompass the binaries that make the basis of our language. But these days, it's far more common for us to choose the colors red and blue. Red is generally associated with masculinity and blue with femininity. Red is a color of passion, of action, of authority. So if you were to choose that as the color that described your father, then you would imagine that he's somebody who is fairly upstanding in the community and is very likely to have been an extremely important person, because the red indicates that this person is a leader, someone who has the ability to make rules and to enforce them. That's the white view of red. But there's also a dark undertone. Every color has both positive and negative. And I'm going to use the ideas of white and black as positive and negative. If the person was dealing with someone who had darker undertones of the red color, then chances are that that person would have been autocratic, angry, overactive, and maybe even downright abusive. Blue is the color most associated with femininity. Now, if it's mum, then she would have been an ideal caregiver. She would have insisted on things being according to the rules. So you had your jobs and you needed to carry those out. She provided for you. She was caring. She listened a lot. She tended to do all of those things that traditional mothers are valorized for doing. On the other hand, if she was a dark mother, someone who was negative in their aspects of blue, then as a child you would have been highly restricted. If that was, however, your father, that's a different thing again. A positive blue as a father would have been someone who was, again, caring, someone who listened a great deal, someone who was able to be trusted. On the other hand, a dark or a father who had negative connotations would have been one who was so strictly bound by rules and regulations that you hardly ever got to do anything fun. And with red and blue, what happens if they both exist in the same person? What happens if there's somebody like red and blue together? If that's your mum and dad, that's a different situation altogether, because here we have elements of both masculine energy and feminine energy. But for that, you'll have to come back next week. See you then.